Hi, and welcome back, listeners. It's so good to be with you here again today. And I have Rihanna with us. And Rihanna, I think you have brought someone special into the studio with you today. Welcome. And then please tell us who you have.
I will. Hi, Ashley. Thanks for having me back again today. And I'm really excited to introduce Daniel Weinshenker. He's the founder and director of EchoStory, a storytelling organization based in Denver, Colorado. He's one of the most seasoned digital storytelling practitioners in the world, having spent 25 years with Story Center, the creators of the digital storytelling movement. Over that time, Daniel has helped over 8,000 people worldwide find and tell their stories in the form of mini movies. He started the Nurse Story program through Story Center and has trained nurses and nurse educators in reflective storytelling for compassion fatigue, moral injury, burnout prevention, and working through ethical dilemmas. And that's where I got to meet Daniel. He picked up a digital story I created from back when I was a nurse about a patient being denied her agency around dying in the hospital. Daniel's also a TEDx speaker. He's keynoted conferences around the world and is a widely published writer. It feels to me, Daniel, like digital storytelling at its root is really about making connection. We share our stories to be witnessed, to educate, and to help others find resonance, recognizing that we're not alone in our journeys. That's why I'm really glad to have you here today, Daniel. I think you have a lot to say about connection. So thanks for joining our podcast today and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, Daniel, thank you so much for being here. It feels so important, the work you have done, and I'm looking so forward to hearing about that.
More people than ever are stepping away from organized religion. So where do we turn for support, meaning, and connection? Hi friends, and welcome to Connection from Here, finding community in a changing world. I'm Michelle Perry.
And I'm Ashley Beatty Perry.
We're so happy you're here.
We've been starting our conversations with this idea of what did community look like or feel like to you in your childhood years, or maybe there was a lack of community. Daniel, if you kind of think back to growing up, what was your experience of community?
That's a good question. And I kind of have two basic answers to that. One was that I grew up in, even though my family got divorced, or my parents got divorced, and that family structure went through that, I did grow up with a therapist for my mom who went back to school when I started school. She was, before that, was a kindergarten teacher. And I just had two very involved parents in a lot of ways. And so time together, like around the dinner table, was an experience. And there are times where I really hated that. Like, not just like, how was your day? Good. But like, really tell me about your day. And there are times when that felt like therapy and I didn't like that so much, but it was like steeped in this idea of good question asking and deep listening. And so the community within my own family was like that. And then the other side of that is that I grew up in, even though like the town that I grew up in, which I always shudder to say it because of what it is now, but I grew up in Palo Alto, California, which is now like one of the most elite places in the world to live. My parents don't live there. Nobody I know lives there anymore. It's a ghost town for me. Boulder, I think, is a lot like that too, in some ways. The Boulder of the 70s is not the Boulder of today. And so that's interesting to talk about ghost towns in a very different sort of way. Wildly expensive that nobody I know can live there. But when I grew up there, it was definitely a very kind of, quote, safe community to grow up in. I felt like I had a lot of independence. I owned the world on my bicycle. I felt really safe there. I went everywhere on my own. I was set free by my parents, probably at the age of 5, on my big wheel, and went wherever I wanted, usually with my pants off. And so I could do that. The other side of that had a huge impact on me was, I remember, I don't know what age I was when this kind of started, this happened, maybe 10, maybe 11. There was a fountain kind of on California Avenue, Main Street or whatever. And there was a guy that started showing up at the fountain who bathed himself in the fountain. And he had this kind of sheepskin rug. And he was basically, and I'm going to use the terms from back then, not the terms I would use today, but he was like the first homeless, vagrant person I had ever seen. And that was impactful. Like, he was the only person in Palo Alto who was homeless. That was the story. And what was interesting is that the story became in the community, and it wasn't like that one person told me this. It was just something that you would hear. And the story that the community started telling about him was that he actually wasn't homeless, that he was a famous author, and he was doing like research or something for his character. And I remember even at that age thinking that that was very strange and that something was off about that. And later, like when I got into college age, that moment, that time, and that narrative stayed with me. And what I started, and I was asking myself, why is that staying with you? Why is that staying with you? And what came to me was something that was deeply problematic, which is that this community couldn't handle the fact that there could be someone that was homeless in the community and had made up its own story about him. So had taken his story away from him and turned it into something that was more palatable to them. Because I don't know, they couldn't think of themselves as a society that would allow that, or that their town could have that. And I think that's in part like what got me started on thinking about agency of our own stories and listening to people instead of speaking for them.
And Daniel, as you're saying that, it's such an interesting contrast that I'm hearing about this stage in your life, because you, as a young boy, here you are at the dinner table and being asked about really how are you in your day. You are able to speak your own story about what is going on for you. But then as you're out and about riding through town, you see a man who is, as you mentioned, the community has made the story about it. And nobody was asking him, how is your day and what is this for you? It's so interesting that the community can really shape the context of it all. I find so fascinating that at the same time, the agency that you had to speak your own story, and then you're witnessing another human who's not speaking at all. Nobody is inquiring about his story. I find that juxtaposition so fascinating. And you're saying as you've thought back through that, it sounds like you've kind of investigated that a little bit yourself, what that means.
Yeah. And actually, I don't even know if my version is correct. And no one's version is correct because no one took the time to listen.
Yeah.
You know, when my girls were young, a neighbor started gathering kids from the neighborhood and making kind of care packages, mostly like hundreds of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and taking this group of kids from the neighborhood that I was in to downtown Denver by the rescue mission, where a lot of people experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity, food insecurity, all those things were there. And it wasn't just like taking them down there and giving out food. Like, I wanted to talk to these kids about talking to strangers, and that there's so many messages about to not talk to strangers. And some of those are completely valid, and knowing where a safe place is and where aren't. But sometimes you just see someone and you're like, that's not a safe place. And it's like, well, let's investigate that more. How do we know when we're in safe places, and what are some safe things to do? And also, it's not just talking to strangers, it's listening to strangers. And so I had them come up with questions that they might be curious about. And so we'd take them downtown, we'd hand out the food, but it wasn't just handing out the food. Some people wanted to talk, and I wanted the kids to be curious. I think that people deserve that, to have people curious about them.
I think that's a really important point you just brought up. The sense of connecting to other human beings. We often come at it from our need to connect, but you're identifying the other's need to be heard as a way to connect. And that listening, like giving out the sandwiches, makes us feel good that we're helping. People want to help. We want to feel good about doing something good in the world, but to be open to the reciprocal need in that transaction. It's not just, here's your sandwich. It's who are you? Tell me about who you are, and then the willingness to listen. And I think that's something we haven't quite touched on in this podcast yet, but about how we find connection, how others are finding connection when we reach out seeking connection. It's pretty profound.
And people have written about this. I'm not the first person, of course, to say this, but I think StoryCorps founder, which is a similar storytelling program to the one that I worked in, said listening is an act of love. And other people have written, I think it was Alice Water, just to be known. There's maybe no more powerful thing in the world than to be known. And we know people by listening. Or I've often thought about Martin Luther King's speech where he talks about, let us judge each other by the content of our character, not our race or creed or religion or anything else. But that just assumes that we know the content of someone else's character, and we don't.
Yeah.
We get to know the content. What does that take then to know the content of someone's character? Well, it takes being able to be with them. It takes being able to listen to them, to experience life with them. Then we can know that. We can't know that until we take the time to listen.
Like the Palo Alto person, the story was created about who they were, and there was no way to learn what the context of his character was.
Right? Only to spend time with him and to ask him if he wanted to. That's assuming that he even wanted that.
Well, right.
Maybe he didn't. And maybe these strangers that we gave food out to really didn't want to have a conversation. And so figuring out, when you say in social work or in lots of other places, maybe in chaplaincy, meet people where they're at. But you have to figure out, how do you figure out where they're at? Sometimes it goes with asking them, or just noticing things, or trying stuff out.
Daniel, do you think, because at a young age, you came from a context where you were heard, you were validated in whatever that experience of the day had been for you, or, that was a caring context. Do you think that's what allowed you to look at your community and, for instance, the one gentleman, and then as you've gone on about your work, that you came from a place that really held your story in such a caring way? Would you say that has been part of driving you to make sure others are heard in the same way?
Oh, yeah, completely. I felt as if what I thought about or what I experienced mattered around the dinner table or breakfast table or whatever. I felt listened to and I felt known.
That feels so important. Rhianna, we've talked so much about what happens when the community is missing or the space of being held, it feels absent, what that can do to someone. But it feels so powerful to me that what happens when someone is, as Daniel said, heard and listened to and made to feel like he mattered. And so the trajectory that can point us, it feels so special that now the gift he's giving others is that exact holding space of your story matters, who you are matters. And Rhianna, I'm thinking of this especially because you had the chance to form a story with Daniel and share your story. Did you feel that kind of resonance for you as you went through the story making process with Daniel?
I actually didn't get to do the story process with Daniel. I did it with a colleague of his who was my professor in seminary. In follow-up, Daniel and I have had conversations. When I made the digital story that we're referring to, which I can put a link to that to this episode, I was in seminary at the time, having left nursing, was training to become a chaplain, and we were asked to create a story for social change. And I thought, I've been a hospice nurse for so long, I don't know that I have a story about social change. And I was validated by my professor who said, you're a subject matter expert on death and dying. And that is huge social change because we live in a culture where people don't talk about death and dying. And so it brought to mind this story that I told about my patient. And when Ian referred my story to Daniel and Daniel said, I want to put it on our nurse story website, I realized I was able to bring this woman's personal struggle at end of life into a story that I think is highly informative and really powerful. And so I felt seen, that I had experienced something as a nurse that I knew changed my life and touched me deeply, but that I could share her story with the world, and that together, my experience of living that encounter with her experience of being in that situation, and then Daniel's work with Nurse Story, bringing it forward to the world, it was a powerful way of being seen and of feeling like there was something meaningful to be shared.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
What did it feel like? I don't know if it's the exact words that he used. I think Ian, right, who was facilitating that space or that workshop for you.
Yeah.
Whether it was the exact words or not, when he said, I think what you just said was, he said to you, you're a subject matter expert.
Those were my words. But yeah, absolutely.
And how did that feel?
I mean, it shaped how I viewed my career as a hospice nurse.
Yeah.
I used to be an activist. So to be in a class that was focused on social justice, I didn't feel like nursing was a form of activism. I felt like I was supposed to think of something I did as an activist. Like if you're working for social justice, you must be doing something that's more like an activist. And it really framed for me that like taking care of people at end of life is a radical act. Now you're a hospice social worker, Daniel. So now you're on this side of it with us and you're doing the same work. And now I'm going to wonder if I can pivot back toward you, if you want to share like how your lens has changed as a storyteller by training as a social worker, or if you want to share a personal story.
Well, I can answer that, but I want to go back to that thing that you said. There are so many things that I've read or heard or whatever that have an impact on me. And one of them was listening to this clip of Utah Phillips, who had a radio show way before podcasts existed, where he brought people on the show and interviewed them. And he is also like a pretty significant storyteller, mostly around union and labor issues, like a Woody Guthrie kind of guy. And one of the things that he said on his show, and I play this for some people in my workshops, is he's like, I was interviewing this cowboy rancher guy, and he's like, gun toting, and I'm sure he was a conservative, this, that, or whatever. And he's like, now, am I going to go and ask him about that kind of stuff? He's going to give me some canned political response. He's like, no, I'm going to ask him about what he knows. I'm going to ask him about the wind and the land, and people will tell you the truth. When you ask them about what they truly know, they'll tell you the truth. And so everyone, yourself included in this example that you gave of being in that workshop, is a subject matter expert on themselves, whether they know it or not. And they become more of a subject matter expert on themselves when you ask them questions. You're going to first get maybe some canned responses that they've said a bunch of times before. And then after a period of time, they start saying things they've never said before, right? This happens with friends too, right?
That's right.
Daniel, I'm thinking too, is the power of the story to connect, but also there is power to keep us from connecting, because the stories, rather than listening, like in the case of the example just then, rather than giving a person space to share their voice and the truth of who they are, to go in, much like the gentleman when you were growing up, here's a story we've already made up about you. We've already decided this is your story. You've never had a voice in any part in that. But because I already have the story made up in my mind, I will never truly know you as long as I hold on to the story I've made about you. So there's something that feels so powerful in saying, who are you? Tell me about you and what you know. It feels like that lies the chance to connect in ways that, as long as we're driving through town with our own story about the unhoused man in the fountain, or as long as we're driving through with our own story about the rancher, and there's a real loss for us personally, because we will never know the stories of these people.
And they will never be known.
That's it. Yes.
Yeah. And also what I heard in your story, Rhianna, was that when you hadn't considered the intersection between nursing and social justice or activism.
Yeah.
And so in asking that question to you, and what I said was, at first we're going to have our answers, which is maybe your answer to that was, no, I'm a nurse. I'm not an activist or an advocate. And that's our own canned responses to ourselves, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and what we do. And then if you choose to take it, and if they're offered to you, there are these spaces wherein you can reevaluate those things. And that's sounds like that's what happened to you. And you're like, oh, there is an intersection here. And
That's
now
right.
you're telling a new story about what you do and maybe who you are or how you show up in the world, because there was a space for you. We keep talking about connection, and we keep talking
Yeah.
about it in terms of connection of you to other people. But I think like the biggest part of the work that I do, to be honest, is the connection between someone and themselves. So that like moment, like what I hear in that moment for you is, yeah, it was great for him to hear that story and for other people. And I'm sure I was impacted by your story. I'm sure others that have watched it are impacted too. But I bet you the person that's been most impacted by your story is you.
It is such a poignant thing you've just named. I think that when I'm sitting here thinking of the storytelling that I have listened to that has really captivated me, one of our previous episodes was with Mary Heffler, who's a friend of mine who's doing moth storytelling and really coming into this beautiful space in her life where now she wants to do a one-woman show, and I hope she does. But listening to stories like that, I feel like I'm seeing some sort of wisdom that the storyteller has curated about themselves through the crafting and then telling of that story, right? So this is going to make me pivot to maybe a challenging question for you, Daniel. Maybe
We
I'm sure it
totally
won't be
skipped over your
challenging.
last question. But
Well, I'm going to ask it
you
again.
can go
So
back to
because
it. I
now I
told
have
you
a,
I'll ramble,
no,
but
no,
I picked
no.
up
I
on
have
something you're saying, and I want to like investigate it a little bit more.
well, and that's what I want to find out about you. So when you decided to write a blog about your child and your wife who was pregnant at the time with cancer, I'm really curious to know how that blog started and what you discovered about yourself during the time that you wrote that blog. Or if this isn't the example, that's a good one to share, but like you started out writing a blog about what was going on. What did you learn about yourself in that process?
Well, I had started writing at a pretty early age. I went to college and I majored in creative writing. I don't know what that means. I went and got a master's degree in creative writing first before any of this work.
But being trained as a creative writer and actually writing a blog about a pretty personally trying time, not the same thing, right?
No, but I feel like I did need at that time. I know that writing was the way that I processed the world. It was my own reflective time. That's how I learned about the world, was through writing. Like how
Yeah.
you don't know how you're going to fill the page, but you have to figure out a way to fill the page. For some people, that's music, or for some people, that's sculpture, or whatever, how they process the world and spit it back out, more or less. And I don't know, my writing was never about like being published or anything like that. It was more of just my own internal process and helped me make sense of the world. And so when my wife at the time, I'll just say my ex-wife, yeah, I was actually in the middle of teaching a workshop, a storytelling workshop out in DC, and some things were going on with her health-wise, to make the story short. And I got a call from her that they had found cancer, and it was stage 4 cancer, and she was 5 months pregnant with who would have been our second child. And I booked out of that, of course, that workshop. I left the workshop and got on a plane, and I was crying in the airport, and strangers were hugging me, and I was allowing myself to be hugged, and that was beautiful. And the first entry of the blog actually is about this, in part, this experience. But I sat down in this row, and there were 2 older women in a row. It's like older adults, way older than me, and they just took care of me the whole time. They ordered little red wine in cups on the airplane.
This is on the airplane.
Gave
Okay.
me their cheese and crackers, and
Oh.
they just took care of me. And I let myself be cared for. And then I also spent a lot of the plane flight writing. And it was a letter to my daughter, who was alive, my 2.5-year-old at that time. It was a letter to her about what was going on, because I knew that she probably wouldn't remember it, and I wanted to capture what was going on for her. But again, like I just said with you, Rhianna, it was also for me. Like,
Yeah.
I need to process what is going on how am I feeling right now? What am I expecting when I go home? How are we going to live with this? Are we going to live with this? All these things. And so I wrote a letter to my daughter. And actually, she just read it. She's 20 years old now, and she read it kind of for the first time. I know I had told her about it before, but maybe she was 11 or whatever. She hadn't remembered. And anyway, she read it for the first time. We've had some really interesting conversations about what her memories are of that time and what are the memories that I captured for me, but also for her.
Because you weren't just journaling, you were blogging. You chose to make this a public sharing.
Yeah, part of that was also, I hadn't intended on that, but then this was before like Facebook or any of my family or friends were on Facebook. Blogging was bigger. And I'm like, I don't have the time. Things were just really crazy. She was pregnant. She had cancer, bad cancer. And, I think, did I say this? She's alive. So I should say that. The fetus is not alive.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. But it was the easiest way for me to tell my family about what was going on every day. I didn't have time to call them all. I didn't have time to answer the phone. I didn't have time to write them all emails. So I'm like, I'm just going to put this stuff here. I didn't just write it like, oh, well, here's what happened today. I wrote it like short stories because that's just the way that I process or, I don't know, express. So there are these little stories every day. And I put those out there and people started sharing the blog with other people. Again, this was way before Facebook. So this was just by email. Hey, this is a friend. And people ended up on that blog from all around the world. I'm still in contact with some of these completely random people in Nepal and wherever, because people wanted, I don't know.
But you do know that's exactly what, that's it. You shared a personal experience that touched other people in a way that it's just like we were talking about. They got to listen to you and they felt connected.
Yeah. And I remember at that point, one of the first things I did to try and get educated was, sure, did I look at clinical trials and all that stuff? Sure. And I went out to the official National Cancer Institute website and blah, blah, blah. But when I really wanted to find out, what I really wanted to know was, what might this be like? And so I went out to other people's blogs and read from the people themselves. There's a certain kind of information we get from trustable, whatever, maybe trustable news sources. And then there was this huge shift right around that time that you go to blogs, that you go to people's individual unfiltered experiences, not filtered through major media. And, I was already involved with Story Center at that time, whose entire purpose was to offer people a space for them to listen to themselves, listen to others, process it in some ways, and put out something, externalize that narrative back out into the world in a certain format, in this case, small movies. But yeah, so I went to people's blogs and I read, and people then came to mine, right?
Daniel, I want to highlight that for a moment too, because it seems to me there's something that when you are able to courageously explore your story, and as you mentioned before, connecting within yourself, and then other people are able to see that happening, it almost gives them some courage, the bravery to connect within themselves. It seems like there's something important about witnessing this person, the depth at which he's connecting with himself gives me the courage to connect within myself, to say, what is my struggle that I'm going through? And I can better do that now because I'm reading the blog, yes, to find out about you, but also I'm reading the blog to say, here is courage in somebody finding out himself. What is the struggle here? Is there hope? Is there joy? Exploring with yourself. And do you sense that that is a piece of it too? The wonderful weirdness of it all is the more that you are connecting with yourself, the next person is better able to connect with themselves. And
oh, sure.
Yeah.
Right? Like people see that in the dancing in public kind of example, if someone asks you alone to dance in public, a lot of people are going to be like, no, I'm not going to do that. I don't want to stick out in that way, or I'm not crazy or whatever. But when there's group doing that, do you want to be part of this group? And then there's safety in there. And that brings me back to thinking about the work that I did at Story Center is never alone. The spaces that I held with people, we always held as group. There's something very special because of what you just said. Makes it safe in part. I mean, if it's facilitated hopefully well, then it makes it a safe space or a brave space or a space that's okay for people to do the exploration because they're seeing someone else do it. Sometimes there's like a weird pressure to that. And there are times where people bucked against that and said, well, I don't want to process something that deep, which is, we tried to make that as okay as possible, but there's that pressure there anyway. I don't know. Did people feel that? Like, I think I feel that when you go to see a play and people start standing up, what is it called? Standing applause?
Standing ovation.
Standing ovation. And someone does it and you weren't going to do it, but then you maybe, I don't know, this is what goes on in my head because I'm a weirdo, but I'm like, oh, maybe I should stand up. I don't want to be the one person sitting down, right? I want to be in the group. Sometimes that's really lovely. Now you're kind of seeing politicized versions of that, or that maybe aren't so lovely, or you think about regimes and all kinds of stuff of wanting to fit in and all do something really awful to fit in. But that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is these spaces, right? And even if it's two people, that's a space. And then the more spaces, I don't know. But that gets me thinking then about, you were asking about hospice and how does this like cross over into hospice work? And actually that part is actually really different because a lot of the times it is just me with one other person. I'm not in group. Bigger group with other people. They're not with someone else who's also going through something similar to what they're going through in talking with me or being listened to by me. Sometimes there's family, but oftentimes there's not. And so that is a different space to hold.
And you know, Daniel, I want to talk to you about the space that's being held is a safe space. That feels so important to me here as we think about people having the courage to look inward and to find what their true story is. I'm thinking about, again, circling back to you as a child, you were being held in safe space, which allowed you to think about another man in a fountain in his story. And so the more safe space we find for ourselves to come into our own story, then we do have the safe context to be able to explore with others. I'm just so drawn to, because you are comfortable in being in your true story, that even in your work, you are able to then provide a safe space. It's not all beautiful, sunshiny and rain, but you know, the real story involves difficulty, and the real story involves the beauty may be found in the difficulty or what, but it's something about because you were able to find that safe space yourself, that is now such an offering to others. The space you're providing is a safe space to do that kind of difficult exploration.
Or it can be. It depends on where people are coming from. Sometimes it's never a safe or brave space, no matter what you do, you know. But I also want to go back to something, I think, Rhianna, you said, it was the opposite of that. It was like the places that we come from or don't come from.
Oh, like when we have a lack of safety as a child or lack of community, and how does that inform us?
Oh, yeah. I've had so many stories in my work. I remember like 3 specific stories of army brats. They would call themselves in their story, you know, like, well, I was an army brat. And so sometimes I do this prompt around third place, which is, I don't know if you know that, there's a whole book written about it. I forget the author, but, you know, societal places that are also personal places. So we have school, and then we have home, and then there's when we're kids or whatever. And then we also have a third place where we make connection. And for some people, that's a church. And for some people, that's the basketball court. And for some people, that's wherever, the barber shop, for some people where they have dialogue and they feel it's a safe place to talk or be heard. And then maybe when we're older, we have work, and then we have home, and then we have another space, meditation group, or who knows what. But I remember, and maybe it was from this prompt, but I remember these 3 different people in different workshops telling the story about growing up as an Army brat, and also like growing up in a family like with violence, maybe. And maybe that came from usually a father that was in the military and the type of childhood they had, and where they didn't feel completely safe. And these three different people, unrelated, different workshops over the span of years, told this story of how their mother would save them by always moving within walking distance, because they were moving around all the time, Army brats. And their mother would always move within walking distance to the local library. And they told stories about how important the library was as a safe space for them to be in the world, and to also escape right into these other narratives that were not their narratives of their world, and being able to live somewhere else in books. So then there was the opposite of that, right? Of where am I going to find the safety, because I don't have it. And you hear many stories as you hear of maybe people like me that were raised in these kind of like really supportive atmospheres, that you hear just as many stories of people that didn't have that, or people that were abused and now do advocate abuse work and hold safe spaces for those who were abused.
I wondered about that with you, because you have held space for the stories of so many undocumented Native youth, foster youth, people suffering gender violence, sexual assault violence. And for you to have the capacity to carry over 8,000 stories, to be with those people, says something about you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious. I'm super curious. I do like to know people. And I also like them. I don't know, maybe there's like a self-aggrandizing thing. I feel valuable in the world when people, through the spaces that I help them hold, get to know themselves or the world better. So it feeds me. I'm not going to be like, oh, I'm selfless and blah, blah, blah.
No, and that's it. Like I said in the beginning, we all look for ways where we think we can offer help or do something that's meaningful because it feels good to do that. So I don't think it's self-aggrandizing. It's just naming exactly what we're talking about here, like where you feel valued and connected and seen and heard and meaningful.
Yeah.
Oh, what a treat to have you here.
What a gift. Oh, Daniel, thank you so much. The work you do and who you are in the world, thank you so much. It is, my gosh, been such a pleasure. And one of the things we usually end with is a segment that we call A Step From Here. And it really is just something kind of on the ground that we can take with us in the coming week that would allow us to have maybe more care and connection with ourselves or to other people. And all the work that you've been doing, I'm wondering, is there a little nugget or something that you can offer that we can take with us this week that would allow for this type of just connection from within that seems to then allow for the connection with others?
Well, some of the stuff that like you just did with me, but I think that people can sometimes do this for themselves, which is to hold space for yourself. I think being able to hold space for others and know the world usually starts with our ability to do that for ourselves. And so like, even in these short interactions that I have with people, I was with a group of nurses yesterday and I asked them just to take 7 minutes to think about a moment in their life. And we had a certain prompt for that one. But the one that I would like maybe ask people to consider maybe is to think of an actual moment, to take 10 minutes, be quiet, and think about a moment in their lives where maybe a belief that they held was something that they no longer held. And when that happened, like when that really happened, and when I mean scene, when I mean moment, I think that's honestly what changes people, as opposed to just talking about, well, here's my view of the world. Like when you ask me about moment and I could tell you about seeing that guy in the fountain, that's different than just saying, well, I feel like everybody's story deserves to be heard. That's different. And so when we identify moments for ourselves, I think that, and the question that you were asked, Rhianna, like, wow, oh, there is this connection that I didn't see before. And you could nail the moment that was at least offered, that space was offered to you. And then when do you act on it? Did you ever act on that changed belief? I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's that you hated blueberries and then you changed your mind when you were 45 that all of a sudden you loved blueberries, and why? Or you thought they were great and you used to think they were gross. But it could be something really pivotal, like what you said, Rhianna, or what I talked about earlier. So take some time, some space to think about that question and try and bring it down to this small, big moment. You may not know that moment, and even better still, you don't know that moment until you choose to sit with that space and asking yourself that question. We can all do that.
That's great.
Daniel, what a gift. Thank you for that. The difference it will make for us and each other. And thank you so much. Oh, it has been a joy.
Yeah, thank
Well,
you
your
so
show
much,
does
Daniel.
that. Your show is doing that right now, and listening to people and
Yeah.
then helping to share that out. And I'm sure that I know that people listen to the podcast and then start thinking about things differently.
That's right.
Yeah.
Oh, what joy. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, listeners. And we appreciate you being with us today. Please continue to communicate with us and let us know what's on your mind. And we will connect again soon.